Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Jon Myer Podcast. Today's topic, Path to Infrastructure Platform Nirvana, using self-service with guardrails. Joining us today is Joe Duffy, who's the founder and CEO of Pulumi. Joe, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Joe, before we get into our topic, we have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. What is infrastructure platform?
Yeah, so definitely these days, everybody's doing the cloud. Everybody's using the cloud to transform how they build their internal applications, their products that they're shipping. And when you're going to the cloud, infrastructure is a thing. You need to manage infrastructure. That can be virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, serverless resources, security. And most organizations over time build sort of a center of excellence around how they manage cloud infrastructure. That these days is leading to infrastructure platforms. Um, Typically, these organizations, there's a group of people that are managing the infrastructure. They need to make sure it's secure, compliant, cost effective, that they're using best practices at all times. But increasingly, these platform teams have to turn around and basically empower developers to get up and running in the cloud as well. Obviously, the cloud has permeated all aspects of software architecture and design, especially AI-driven applications, really need infinite compute. But developers themselves are not necessarily experts in all things infrastructure. So this infrastructure platform typically is enabling developers to be self-serve without needing to be infrastructure experts. And increasingly common, it's not a new thing, it's sort of DevOps plus plus, but is definitely top of mind for a lot of organizations these days.
It's like an upgrade to DevOps where, infrastructure, you had your infrastructure team, right? And then you have your application team. DevOps was deploying it out, doing your infrastructure and deploying it out. I guess there's some confusion and some things you need to take into consideration. You have an infrastructure platform team that deploys it out and manages the application. Like, how do you kind of separate, or how do you look at the two?
Yeah, I will also say there's no one right answer. A lot of teams have to figure out what is right for themselves. Um, a friend of mine likes to say, sometimes uh, DevOps was more about bringing dev into the ops than it was putting ops into the dev. And I think now we're realizing that developers need to, you know, they don't need to know what a VPC is or what a Kubernetes cluster is, but should they have to file a ticket and wait a month just to get a new microservice or to get a new data store? No, probably not. Some things are naturally on that side of the line. I think, infrastructure teams typically are the ones to spin up the gnarly, low level secure, the clusters, the security IAM roles. But developers really need access to the things that are in their realm, containers, container registries, data services, AI services. And so what we find to be important is that the infrastructure team builds to be flexible so that it's a policy decision what developers can go self-serve versus one being implied by arbitrary technical decisions.
Joe, is this a new role, the infrastructure platform role?
It's a little bit new. I think it's emerged slowly over time, but it's definitely different than, let's say, typical IT and sys administration. I think it's more, a lot of folks treat it like a product. A lot of folks say, hey, your infrastructure platform really is a product, and your end users are the developers and other infrastructure engineers who are going to provision services using that product. And so that's led to more of a software engineering mindset when it comes to the infrastructure platform. Like I said, it's been an evolution, right? Like at some point we did DevOps, and that brought a lot of engineering practices to how we did infrastructure. And then, site reliability engineering became a thing, and that was very much an engineering oriented mindset. And so it's really the culmination of all of those things in the trajectory.
Joe, is this a third party role or an internal role?
Some people do try to outsource it. I see mostly it's an internal role. Um, and I'll say some teams they don't work this way, right? Like, you look at the Amazon model, the two pizza team model. In those cases, you say, hey, if you're building a backend service, you're a software engineer and you manage the infrastructure as well. Even in those sorts of teams, though, we often find you do want a center of excellence, the people that are going to care deeply about security, compliance, cost management. But definitely, some folks try to outsource it. I would say I don't see a ton of success with folks doing that.
Yeah, I don't see it really being successfully outsourced because it's more of an internal thing. You can't outsource. I don't say you can't, but it's very difficult for you to outsource that component of your infrastructure while there's still an internal application or internal team that's handling the application role.
Yeah, and I think it gets to the mindset also. I think part of this shift has been thinking about infrastructure not as a cost center or a burden, like thinking about the cloud as an afterthought. It really is deeply ingrained in how these teams operate. You know, the cloud is very important. It's thanks to the cloud we can use infinite compute for AI and data for data warehouses, and the cloud is actually something that's not a an expense, but rather part of building a business.
Does this make sense for small, medium, or even just large enterprise companies?
Great question, because I do think there's a bit of a platform engineering meme going around. It's a popular term, and there are folks that say, well, company X did it, so therefore I must do it as well. I do think smaller teams, it can be a little bit of overkill to go have a dedicated group. In fact, some customers we've worked with, they said explicitly, we're not going to do that, because why would I bifurcate the team prematurely? And instead, they just have their engineers more that two pizza model. But definitely large enterprises, definitely seeing a lot of folks going down this path, and for good reason, right? You want that center of excellence. You don't want the silos and the having this spread all over the place. And so having one team who's responsible for helping empower the rest of the organization totally makes sense.
Joe, you mentioned platform engineering, and I'm glad you actually touched on that because a quick question: platform engineering, infrastructure platform, are they the same thing, or are we just rebranding it? Is it a term being used internally, or is it just one and the same?
I think it's all different shades of one and the same thing. And frankly, I think it's just an evolution of DevOps. I think it's okay. Sometimes you got to give something a new name just to give it an identity, and to be able to have a conversation about, okay, what's different now than 10 years ago, kind of thing. But to me, it's just different gradients of the same set of ideas.
That's almost like cloud financial management being rebranded as finops. We just have to give it a new term in order for people to care or have a new value to it.
Well, and it does help to do a little bit of marketing around this, right? It gets it on the radar of, it gives Gartner something they can write about, and then CIOs take notice, like, oh, there's this new platform engineering thing. Have you heard of this? And you know, then the
That's
folks,
like DevOps, and we rebrand that to something else, and people are like, "Oh, we have to go on to this. This is pretty cool." And it's like, guys, we've been doing this for a while.
right? And then DevSecOps, like, oh, because security wasn't always important, right? So now it is.
Right?
Suddenly that's new,
We had to throw that into the term.
right?
Joe, talk to me about how infrastructure as code will play a role in this, though.
Yeah, infrastructure as code is sort of table stakes these days for how you manage infrastructure. It allows you to codify these best practices. So if you think of what the infrastructure platform team does, oftentimes they want to develop a set of infrastructure abstractions that sort of include best practices. So for example, Acme Corp may have a certain way that they want to configure Kubernetes clusters, and they want to make sure they're secure, compliant, cost effective. So this infrastructure platform team will typically figure out, okay, here's what EKS for us looks like. Here's what AKS on Azure, looks like for us. And they'll build these reusable patterns, and then maybe they'll go get the security team to review it and bless it and say, yes, this is the good way to do it. And then maybe they'll turn around and give developers the ability to spin up Kubernetes clusters without being experts on what it means to provision these. And infrastructure as code is sort of the magic that makes all of that happen. I would say the interface into the infrastructure platform, I would argue we've sort of always had an infrastructure platform. It just used to be, the interface used to be a ticketing system. So you'd go file a ticket and then wait a month and then you get your database, right? Then now, especially because of infrastructure as code, you can have no code interfaces where it's still point and click to spin something up. You can have low code interfaces with YAML. You can have full blown code interfaces thanks to infrastructure as code. So a lot of flexibility in how people consume that platform, but at the center of it, really IAC is powering it.
Joe, if I were to ask you to summarize what infrastructure platform is in 30 seconds, clearly define it, what would you say?
So an infrastructure platform is the enabler for the entire organization to take full advantage of the cloud, to let developers ship faster with confidence, to make sure everything in the cloud is secure, compliant, cost effective, and to basically make the CISO happy that, hey, we can move fast without breaking things.
Joe, there's a lot of companies out there that kind of do something similar. If you take some of the stuff that are built natively by cloud providers, and we'll take AWS as an example, they have what's called a service catalog where you can go in and you can order certain things and predict and deploy it out into the environment. These are well-known deployable environments for them, right? Accounts or maybe VPCs or whatever it is. Is that the same thing, but it's being done through another interface developed by a company internally?
It's very similar. In fact, some people might say, hey, our internal developer platform is actually just the AWS service catalog. And maybe they have some custom templates that they're going to write themselves and publish to that catalog. Um, the thing that we see often is that folks care about multiple clouds. You might not just be provisioning even AWS, Azure, Google Cloud resources. Maybe it's Kubernetes resources. Maybe it's even Datadog or Snowflake or Cloudflare or MongoDB. And so a lot of times these cloud-based solutions are single cloud by nature. So that's one reason that people go the route of having a different internal platform. There's a lot of custom needs too. When I sort of glossed over what is that interface, well, a lot of times that interface is custom to the company's needs. Maybe actually it's an API and it's going to be integrated into a bunch of different systems internally. And that said, there's a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting that I see people doing. Like a lot of people building out the platform and basically doing the same exact things that really aren't adding value to the business.
One of the key things where I look at this, and we talked about one cloud provider, but you mentioned multiple clouds, right? We all know multi-cloud exists. Even all the cloud providers have said, yes, we know they're around there, even though they've been around. Is that for a company to develop this, one of the things that they look at is maybe they want to deploy Kubernetes. And they looked at all the aspects of it and they said, Azure is the best thing, not only for the performance, the cost, the evaluation, and the region, but maybe I want to deploy out SAP and AWS is. Now, you deploying out one of these infrastructure platforms in a click, right? You go and click on it. It really doesn't matter what the underlying support infrastructure is or cloud provider. It really kind of geared towards a company, the needs, the security, and the cost, right?
Yeah. And, I can't tell you how many companies I talk to who say, oh, we're 100% AWS. And then you talk to them a few years later and like, well, we acquired a company that was using Azure, or my
Yep.
CIO struck a deal, with Azure where we get better cost from Azure.
Yep.
And so we're going to have to go start adopting a different cloud. And a lot of people end up multi-cloud, even if they don't know they're going to from the outset. Um, and yeah, you're right. Like in some sense, does a developer really care as much if they get a Kubernetes cluster and
Yep.
where it's running?
Nope. As long
Sometimes
as
they
their
do, for sure.
application's up, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Joe, what are some of the key challenges though when you're trying to implement this?
The biggest challenge I think is what are the best practices? How do I configure an EKS cluster? How do I configure a VPC? So these infrastructure platform teams, and frankly, that is sort of the problem you want folks to focus on. I'd say that's one of the real underlying inherently difficult challenges. There's a lot of like superficial ones, like writing, a YAML transpiler layer or building a point and click portal so that my team can go point and click. Like you're not going to differentiate on your infrastructure platform by having a better point and click portal than your competitor. And yet a lot of folks have to go spend a whole bunch of time on these tedious, undifferentiated tasks. But like actually figuring out what does it mean to be secure? What does it mean to be compliant? How do I make sure it's cost effective? What is the abstraction I want to expose to my developers? Uh, like a friend of mine was one of the creators of Kubernetes, and he liked to call it the Goldilocks abstraction. It's not too high level, it's not too low level, it's just right. And a lot of these infrastructure platform teams need to figure out kind of what are their Goldilocks abstractions that they want to go give to developers, knowing that developers aren't going to be experts in all things cloud infrastructure, and yet a lot of times they do need to tweak some knobs, right? Maybe they care about how many nodes are in my Kubernetes cluster. Maybe they sometimes need to plug in a GPU node pool because they're going to run some AI workloads or something. That tends to be a pretty difficult challenge.
Joe, one of the trouble or the challenges that I see is that where are the best practices for this, right? And it does, and each company has their own best practice for implementing their cloud center of excellence, the security guidelines, guardrails in place for things that they can and can't do are all customizable for each company. And that's where you have to keep, like you want a new service. Oh, great. I want to deploy this out. Oh, sorry, we don't have that readily available in our infrastructure platform. We have to go develop it for you. Then people are going around the process. Now we've got Shadow IT jumping there again, deploying it out, and then you have to reinvent it. So you have to have some of those best practices, those guardrails, those guidelines before even implementing these.
Yeah, and this is one reason why we're really excited about infrastructure as code. If the approach that we've taken with infrastructure as code is to embrace general programming languages, and these things are great at sharing and reusing best practices and encapsulating details. Like that has been the secret for how we've built bigger pieces of software out of smaller pieces of software over many decades in the industry. And so we're now able to apply that to infrastructure. So we actually have a lot of best practices that are kind of out there in the world that you can just pick up and reuse and not have to recreate the wheel. Like when we started, it was kind of crazy to me, how do you provision a secure VPC in Amazon, a virtual private cloud? Well, go read this 30-page white paper and good luck. And that was sort of the state of the art. And now we have a VPC component where you just write a few lines of code. I think you also touched on a very important point, which is infrastructure platform teams need to decide how hardcore the guardrails are going to be. Like if an end user comes to your platform and they're only limited to those components that you have thought to expose from day one, fundamentally, there's going to be a lot of the cloud they can't access, and you're always going to be playing catch up. Many organizations let end users consume patterns that the platform team hasn't actually blessed yet. And that's an important decision people have to make. Sometimes you really want things locked down. Sometimes you're going to be like, hey, provided you don't open a database to the internet, we're going to let you actually consume raw AWS services, even if they're not supported by components in the platform itself. So that is a key decision point for folks.
Joe, one of the other things that you were talking about, like AWS and deploying, I know we're using AWS as a huge example, but other cloud providers provide some of these toolings that are already in place. AWS has a service called Control Tower, which you can put all these guardrails in place, and you don't even have to worry about developing the infrastructure platform to deploy out the new VPC or the environment because the guardrails are already there. That's one of the things that actually is a huge value if you're trying to develop this in-house. Joe, before I wrap things up, my last question for you is, what are some of the tried and true solutions to these problems you see working at a large scale?
Yeah, I think, well, Pulumi, the company I work for, for infrastructure as code, a lot of folks are finding success, using Pulumi for the infrastructure as code portion of it. I think, a lot of folks out there using Terraform, CloudFormation, CDK. Each of the cloud providers does have an IAC solution. Like Azure has Azure Resource Manager and Bicep. And so there is a lot of choice out there in the world for infrastructure as code. That tends to be like the first step is figuring out the infrastructure as code portion of it, because that's going to be the thing you use to codify the best practices, to scale them out. That's going to kind of dictate what interface you can expose to your end users. And so I would suggest that as like step number one. And then each of these solutions has ecosystems of existing components out there. Like CDK has constructs, Terraform has modules, Pulumi has components. So you don't have to feel like you're recreating the wheel from scratch. So I would say like learn from what's out there already. The unfortunate reality though is most large enterprises especially have such custom needs that they do have to kind of roll their own best practices. I hope in 5 years that is not the case, and we're certainly working on trying to make that not the case, but that is the unfortunate reality of the world today.
I love the one part that you talked on is that there's already things out there that have developed these tried and true practices that have an excellent reputation, that have already went through some of the problems. Don't reinvent the wheel, but utilize some of that to do your best practices, do your internal guidelines, and then to develop your infrastructure platform.
Absolutely. I think, I still, even with all of those best practices, I still see a lot of people kind of going down the same paths, learning the same things, making the same mistakes, and ending up ultimately in a very similar spot. So it's, as much as you can learn from others, I definitely recommend spending the time up front. It's so it's so tempting just to dive in and start writing code, but a little bit of research up front can save you a lot of time. And hey, go ask ChatGPT. I'm sure it can help you as well.
We will not touch on that on this episode on asking ChatGPT, but I will give you a little bit of advice. Do not ask it directly to create you a CloudFormation template full on of everything, because it takes a little bit. It's still learning. I've tried it out in a number of ways, and trying to create my infrastructure as code through a CloudFormation template probably took me a week when I probably could have just written it myself.
I will say, quick plug, Pulumi Copilot. We did train our Copilot, which is available for free, that on infrastructure as code, so that it can actually produce high quality Pulumi infrastructure as code in any language. So give it a try.
Okay, that was not an intentional plug, but I have to go and take a look at it because I was asking it to do some of this stuff and I was like, man, I should just wrote it myself. Well, Joe, I really appreciate your time on talking to this discussion around Path, the infrastructure platform Nirvana.
Thank you so much, John. It was fun.
Yeah, definitely. All right, everybody, don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify, because guess what? We're out of here.